The snow-covered forest held its breath as a colossal Siberian tiger stepped out from between the frozen pines. His orange and black stripes burned against the pale winter world, each movement slow, deliberate, the quiet confidence of a creature born to rule the wilderness. Maria stood alone in the clearing, 85 years old, a thin coat wrapped around her frail body, one hand gripping an old wooden cane that had seen more winters than she cared to count. The tiger's amber eyes locked onto hers. There was no wind, no sound, just an ancient predator staring into the soul of a woman who should have turned and run. Then he charged. 400 pounds of pure muscle racing across the snow, each bound shaking the earth beneath him, closing the distance between a wild killer and the elderly woman who had walked into his territory with nothing but a cane and a memory he should not have kept. The rangers behind her screamed. Guns were raised. Orders barked. But Maria did not move. She lifted her cane, slow, steady, the same way she had so many years ago when a dying tiger cub fit in the cradle of her arms. And as the beast thundered toward her, she whispered his name. A name she had not spoken in 3 decades. Solstice. 30 years earlier, Maria had been a 55-year-old widow living in a silent apartment that felt colder than any winter. Her children were grown, her career as a nurse was over, and each day felt like she was fading a little more. One afternoon, she found a small notice on a bulletin board. Volunteers needed at a wildlife rehabilitation outpost. Remote, harsh, compassion required. Compassion. That was the one thing she still had left. Within weeks, Maria arrived at a tiny outpost deep in a Russian forest. 2 wooden cabins, a shed, and endless snow swallowing the horizon. She cleaned enclosures, fed injured animals, and worked harder than she had in years. But nothing prepared her for the night the ranger ran in holding a bundle of orange and black fur. A tiger cub, barely breathing. Frozen, starving, burning with fever. The veterinarian didn't sugarcoat it. He won't make it through the night. Maria stepped forward before she even realized it. I'll sit with him. Someone should be there if he goes. They let her. All night she held him near the stove, his tiny body shivering against her hands. She whispered to him the way she once whispered to frightened patients in hospital beds. Just before dawn, the cub pressed his nose weakly against her wrist, a fragile spark of life choosing not to go out. From that night on, Maria became his anchor. She fed him broth drop by drop, kept him warm, slept beside his pen when the fever returned, and laughed the first time he tried to walk and collapsed directly onto her boots. She named him Solstice because he arrived on the longest, darkest night and still found a way to survive. Months passed. He grew strong enough to be wild again. On the morning of his release, Maria wrapped her arms around him one last time, feeling the deep, steady thrum of his heartbeat. "I'll see you again someday," she whispered, a promise made softly into his fur. She didn't expect it to ever come true, but Solstice paused at the edge of the trees and looked back at her with those amber eyes, as if he understood. Then he was gone. And for the next 30 years, Maria carried that promise like a quiet flame she thought would never burn again. If stories like this touch something in you, don't forget to subscribe. We share the kind of true-hearted moments that stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Maria wasn't meant to be awake that late. 85-year-old bodies rarely tolerate sleepless nights, but on that particular evening, her mind refused to rest. The television was on for company, muted, flickering blue light across her small living room. A nature documentary played. Snowy forests, Siberian winds, the kind of distant world she once knew. She wasn't watching, not until the camera cut to a tiger moving through a field of untouched snow. Massive, regal, alive. Maria reached for her glasses, heart thudding harder than it had in years. The camera zoomed in, and there, right between his amber eyes, a symbol she could never forget. A faint, star-like marking, not perfect, not bold, just a quiet echo of the tiny cub she had once held against her chest. Her breath caught. The room spun. Solstice. The name left her lips like a prayer she had buried for decades. The narrator mentioned his tracking code, his age, unusually old for a wild tiger, and the protected reserve he ruled as a solitary ghost. Maria didn't hear anything else. The promise she'd made 30 years ago suddenly felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her in the frozen pines of a land she thought she'd never see again. By morning, her decision was made. Her hands trembled as she packed a small suitcase, as she wrote a note for her daughter, as she slipped her old cane into its loop, like preparing for an old dance. Everyone she spoke to said the same thing. You can't travel at your age. It's too far. It's too dangerous. But Maria had lived a long life, and she knew something with absolute clarity. Danger means nothing when a promise is older than fear. 3 flights, 2 long layovers, a car ride through endless snow, hours of silence broken only by the sound of tires biting into ice. And then, the wooden sign of the reserve rose from the frozen ground like a gateway to a life she thought she had left behind. Maria stepped out of the car slowly, leaning on her cane, her breath shaking in the cold. Somewhere beyond those trees, a tiger with a star on his brow still walked the earth, and she had come to keep her word. The forest was quieter than it should have been. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the heavy waiting kind that settles over a place right before something unimaginable happens. Maria moved slowly through the snow, her cane sinking with every step. The rangers had told her to stay inside the cabin, but the pull in her chest felt stronger than any warning. She wasn't searching, not really. It felt more like walking toward a memory she could suddenly touch again. Then she saw the tracks, large, fresh, pressed deep into the white surface as if the earth itself bowed under their weight. Maria followed them, her breath sharp in the icy air. A faint rumble rolled through the trees, low, deep, unmistakable, the sound of a creature that did not need to prove its power. Maria stopped. Between 2 towering pines, a shape emerged. Massive shoulders, orange and black stripes, amber eyes that burned like winter fire. Solstice, older, scarred, a king carved by time. For a moment, he didn't recognize the small, fragile figure standing alone in the snow. He lowered his head, muscles coiled, his body sinking into the stance of a hunter ready to strike. Snow shifted beneath his paws. Maria lifted her cane, slowly, carefully, the same quiet gesture she had made 3 decades earlier inside a wooden cabin with a dying cub in her arms. Her voice trembled but did not break. Solstice, it's me. The tiger growled, a warning, a command to run. She didn't move. He took a step forward, then another. The ground shook with each stride, snow spraying at his sides as he closed the distance between predator and the woman he should have forgotten. Maria felt the heat of his breath before she saw his eyes clearly, eyes she had stared into through nights of fever and fear. His growl faded, his ears twitched, his gaze sharpened, recognition striking like lightning. Solstice stopped inches from her, head lowered, snow melting beneath his breath. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Maria reached out a trembling hand and touched the side of his face. His fur was rougher now, warmer, alive. A sound rose from Solstice's chest. Not a growl, not a roar, but a low, rumbling exhale that carried something ancient and heartbreakingly gentle. He pressed his forehead against her shoulder. Maria's knees faltered as decades of longing collapsed into a single moment. I kept my promise, she whispered. The tiger's weight leaned into her just a little, a gesture that felt like gratitude or forgiveness or something the human heart was never built to name. And for the first time in 30 years, Maria felt whole. For days after their reunion, Solstice returned to the clearing every morning. Not close enough to be tamed, but not distant enough to forget. He walked the tree line like a silent guardian, sometimes lying in the snow while Maria sat on a fallen log, talking to him about a life he could never understand. But winter in the Siberian reserve was not kind to 85-year-old bones. Each morning became a little harder, each breath a little thinner. Maria hid it well, but Solstice sensed it. A predator's instinct for weakness turned into something gentler. One afternoon, as the sun sank into a pale orange haze, Maria's legs finally gave out. Just a slow collapse into the snow, as quiet as a tired sigh. She wasn't afraid, not anymore. The world dimmed. The cold numbed the ache in her chest. And then, a familiar shape appeared through the trees. Solstice stepped toward her, not with the power of a king, but with the careful steps of a creature afraid of breaking something fragile. He lowered himself beside her, his massive body curling around her small frame, shielding her from the wind. Maria lifted a trembling hand and placed it against his fur one last time. "You made it," she whispered. "I kept my promise. And so did you." Her hand slipped gently away, her breath faded like snowfall. Solstice remained still, as if refusing to believe what instinct already knew. When the rangers found them at dawn, Maria lay peacefully against the tiger's flank. A quiet smile frozen on her lips. They expected Solstice to flee at the sound of approaching footsteps. He didn't. He rose slowly, looked down at her one last time, and released a low, trembling sound. Not a roar, but something raw and ancient and filled with grief no human language could hold. Then he walked into the forest without looking back. For 3 days, rangers spotted him circling the area, returning to the clearing again and again, as if waiting for her to stand up and follow. On the 4th day, he was gone. No tracks, no sightings, only silence. Some said he wandered deeper into the reserve. Others believed he lay down somewhere far from human eyes and let the snow take him. But those who knew Maria and knew the bond she forged in that tiny outpost 30 years earlier, they liked to believe that Solstice simply followed her the way he had once followed her voice as a dying cub. Two spirits meeting in winter, kept together by a promise stronger than time.